Hello, it's Bob Wells here, and welcome back to the Undercurrent Stories podcast. In this third and final episode of our mini-series about the history of religion, I'm joined once again by Professor Robin Dunbar. Together we explore how religion helped build early cities, hold societies together, and create powerful us versus them identities. We discuss the rise of organised religion, why belief systems surge in times of crisis, whether religion is truly in decline in the modern world, and what the future of faith might look like. From ancient empires to today's global tensions, religion has fueled some of history's greatest conflicts. However, this final episode asks a really big question. What role will religion play in humanity's next chapter? I hope you enjoy the show. You could argue then that without religion, notwithstanding the wars that have been fought between them and all the rest of it, you could argue, I would suggest, that it would have been very difficult for humans to have continued to coexist without some sort of bonding such as religion.
I think so. I think the capacity to maintain very large groups and particularly groups beyond the sort of 150 corresponds to the kind of clan or territorial grouping.
This is your number, isn't it? The Dunbar number.
Yes, Dunbar's number.
Yes, Dunbar's number.
But hunter-gatherers don't live in those groups at all. They subdivide these clans into smaller ecological units, bands they're often known as, which are camping groups. So the people that live together, typically about 30 to 50 people, but they have to come together, every year or two for kind of some big religious or puberty ceremonies. Those are usually the excuses, in which there's an awful lot of singing and dancing for the whole clan, and it creates this sense of bondedness. And we managed to extrapolate these kind of mechanisms out beyond that, out to the tribe, which is perhaps 10 times bigger in these small-scale societies, about 1,500 people. And, we manage it on a massive scale. Although it creates very weak relationships, nonetheless, it creates some sense of belonging to a community. And this has to do with things like having flags and national anthems and all these kind of things, and common beliefs and common fairy tales and common stories that everybody knows and common songs. But the core to a lot of this really is just keeping that inner group of 150 together, rather than these very big. I mean, the tribal groups and super tribes beyond that are really much more transactional, business-based things. They're the basis for exchange and protection and stuff. The social community is this 150 grouping, which turns out to correspond to the typical size of villages right through history until perhaps the last century or so. But the problem I think we had really came, and for these kind of dispersed hunter-gatherer societies, their kind of shamanistic, experiential, immersive religions work very well. There's no need for a theology or anything like that. You just do it when you feel like it. But I think the real crunch came when people started to settle in permanent villages after the last ice age. So, in a period after the last ice age, when much of the subtropical regions of the world were extremely rich. So this is known as the Green Sahara period. The Sahara was not a desert. It was extremely well watered. There were 5 major rivers crossing the Sahara, only one of which remains, and that's the Nile, and it's about 1/10 of its original size. At this time, we're talking about 8,000 years ago, after the end of the last ice age. So you had hippopotamuses and monkeys and flamingos and fishes and crocodiles and all these kind of things living in these lakes and rivers, and yes, lots of antelope, and it was extremely rich. And at the time, and that really created an intense problem in terms of just population density. The human population seems to have exploded in these areas. It's known as the subtropical zone. The northern subtropical zone runs across the top of essentially the Mediterranean and the North African coast, and then it goes right the way through a kind of Mesopotamia, as it were, the eastern end of the Mediterranean and beyond through Mesopotamia, Iraq as it now is, Iran, right the way across the Ganges plain in India and through into China in the Great Basin between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And that was experienced this incredibly rich environment during this period. Population growth going mad, and people started to essentially raid each other, I think is what happened. And it's that forced people to live in villages for defense and to congregate the whole of the clan initially in one village. And villages then very quickly grew into towns of, a few thousand people. And eventually after only a couple of thousand years, you get to sort of historic Jericho, which, boasted about 10,000 people at the end of this period. And the problem you have here is, to put it very bluntly, is how on earth do you stop everybody killing each other? Because living cramped on top of each other, and they really were. If you look at these archaeological sites, they're unbelievably cramped together. No windows. The only way in is through the roof, because that's more defendable. Big walls around the outside. The only way you solve this problem, I think, is by having some massively powerful integrating force, and religion seems to have played a very prominent role at that point, because that's exactly when you start to see the appearance of what are often known as doctrinal religions. So these sort of multiple gods. We have a god for every feature of the world, as it were. You start to see buildings which appear to be not living spaces. They appear to be ritual spaces. You start to see evidence of priestly castes set aside, of sacrifices. Often these buildings have a sort of sacrificial altar of some kind that's clear from the fact that it has sort of grooves in it and around the edges for blood to run out of. You often see skulls being embedded in walls. You start to see serious burials of humans, often in the floor, under the floor. You walk on top of Granny, basically, to remind you of the extended family. And you have to remember this 150 is an extended family. It is the limits of extended family.
Yes.
Under conditions of natural birth and natural death, you would end up with about 150 people as the living descendants, as it were, of a couple of great grandparents. So there's very much a sense of trying to enhance the family cohesion, if you like, to act as a defensive force against raiding by outsiders. And herein lies, in some sense, the secret of religion, because all these religions seem to be built very firmly on an us versus them psychology. That's why they're so powerful. And it's why even now they can trigger an immense sense of belonging, even though you're complete strangers. You're a brother or a sister in my religion. You're a brother or a sister, is how it feels. And people will go to defend co-religionists, as we are so painfully aware, even though these people are totally unconnected to you, have no historical, genetic, cultural, whatever, other than religion. They share none of these things that normally are part of creating a kinship group. So it seems to trigger this very, very powerful force. And of course, it's while that works extremely well and still does, it has this terrible disadvantage that it can lead to mass attempts at conquest and conversion.
Yes. There's so much more. There's so much more I'd like to talk about, but I'm conscious of your time, Robin. But I've got a couple of more questions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, because we could never do the whole book. We might have to do a part two. If we're up for a part two, we could cover things like schism, cults, sex.
Very interesting.
There'd be a lot more to talk about. But the question I've got, one of the questions I've got is, we keep being told that we live in a very secular society, religion's on the way down, more and more people are living on their own. What's your own view on that? Do you think religion is in decline, or do you think it will continue?
Oh, I think it is quite clearly in decline, at least in the West, the industrialized West in particular. But that seems to be because we've had relatively peaceful and prosperous times. So there's quite a lot of evidence now that there's a resurgence in religion whenever things get bad, either economically or politically, or warfare, civil wars, lead to a massive resurgence in religion. And indeed, that's probably the origins, as my suspicion is, that's the origins of the the revealed religions, the contemporary world religions as we have them, the Abrahamic religions, the Indian, most of the Indian religions. What's interesting about them is they all emerged at the same time in the same geographical area. They emerged in this northern subtropical zone around 1500 BC to about 500 AD, something of that order, 2,000 year span. They're known as that's known as the Axial Age, and these are the Axial Age religions, they're sometimes called. But what's interesting about them is the time at which they emerged was a time of enormous political instability. The Green Sahara came to a rather abrupt end about 4,000 years ago. Climate change dramatically went much drier. The Sahara essentially dried out, and from being this incredibly well-watered region to what it is now, desert, over a span of just 300 years. And this threw the whole of that whole basin and probably much, much further afield into total chaos, basically. So you had a lot of invasions of the Mediterranean basin coming up out of Europe, known as the Sea People in the eastern end of the Mediterranean, who came down through the Balkans, through Greece, and laid waste to practically everything. I mean, every single city within 30 miles of the coast around the eastern Mediterranean was torched. And at this period you have, and the same thing happened in India, the collapse of the major empire that was then there in the Upper Ganges basin, the Harappan Empire, collapsed at the same time. You had a similar collapse of nascent empire in China in the Great Basin. And that's exactly the point at which you get sort of these prophets appearing with these new religions, which are extremely powerful. They're all essentially monotheistic. They're all a big shift from having religions of the doctrinal polytheistic kind, where you have lots of gods who basically aren't interested in humans until you don't do the right sacrifices. They're not. They're mostly very badly behaved themselves. If you have a look at the Roman Greek gods or the Viking gods, they really were dreadful people. But they needed you to do the right sacrifices, and they would get very cross if you didn't. But otherwise, they weren't really interested in what humans did. And suddenly, you have these religions which are all about a single monotheistic God, who is deeply interested in the welfare of his or her, as the case may be, adherents, and much less interested in having sacrifices made to them, much more interested in your behaving civilly, as you might put it, towards each other. Of course, coming along and doing a few rituals on a religious service in your new temple, as it were. It really is a big sea change. And I think that kind of introduced a level of bonding. And what's interesting, actually, is they all appear to have their origins in political groupings, if you like, nascent sort of empires and kingdoms where the population was around 1 million people. So it looks like that was a particularly stressful problem. So you've got these sort of little empires kicking around the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, the Egyptian pharaohs and so on, with large numbers of people, highly structured, highly organized. And suddenly the whole place is falling apart, and the agriculture is collapsing because people can't get out to till their fields and harvest their crops and so on because of all these raiders roaming around. And everything's in complete terminal collapse, and you've got these sort of religious leaders appearing up saying, well, actually, I've got the secret of life, just believe and everything will be okay. And so giving us the axial age religions.
I guess it could happen again if there was extreme turmoil. People might turn to something other than their government.
I think so, yeah. There have been several studies that have looked at the consequences of civil wars in various parts of the world and shown that there's a dramatic rise in religions, often new sects appearing, new cults appearing as a result of dissatisfaction. And if you think back, the hippie 60s, which neither of us can remember because we were there.
Yes, you don't admit you remember the 60s, do you?
No, you're not supposed to if you were there. But I mean, that was interesting because in a funny sort of way, it was a lot of, although it was the aftermath of the Second World War, but you'd had a decade or so of extreme prosperity and growth, economic growth. People were very dissatisfied with what was going on because you ran straight into the Vietnam War and so on. Huge conscription on the part of the Americans, and we played a very, very minor role only there. Weren't heavily involved, but clearly the Vietnam War caused massive, if you like, resentment among the youth. And I think the hippie movement there probably came out of that and was a sort of resurgence of forms of religion, often laced with Hindu and Buddhist thinking, as it
and LSD.
Well, that helped enormously.
Yeah. And one last question I've got, if that's okay, is what feedback have you received about the book from, say, rabbis and imams and vicars?
Well, I was sort of nervously expecting a negative reaction. The only reactions I've had have actually been from Christian vicars, as it were, religious folk who generally liked the ideas in the book a great deal.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Most of these will have been kind of Church of England end of the spectrum, rather than fundamentalist Protestants. But we did do. It's interesting. We did do, in order to look at the bonding processes involved in religious services. We actually did a series of studies of various denominations, from Pentecostals through to Catholics. The Pentecostals weren't very forthcoming about being involved, but certainly the Anglicans and Catholics and some of the other Presbyterian type churches around Oxfordshire, mainly this was done, were very happy to let us loose on their congregation, test them for endorphin production before and after services. And we also had a couple of mosques in London allow us to go. Unfortunately, we got the mosques were done at the end of this study, and we ran straight into the back of lockdown.
Oh, right.
So we never really had enough data from the mosques to do it. And then by the time we were able to emerge out of lockdown, everybody had moved on and were no longer in a position to continue the study. But all of those were very positive on the whole, it seems.
Well, Robin, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. We said earlier on, it's not a spiritual book. It's a history of how religions came to be. It's mixed with, human nature, science and all the rest of it. It's an absolutely fascinating book, and I can recommend it to anybody who wants to know a little bit more about it.
Yes, well, it was an attempt to understand why humans are so religious. I mean, it is very characteristic of our species.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation, Robin, about how religion emerged, not just as belief, but as a powerful social glue, how it shaped our communities, strengthened bonds, and how it's helped humans navigate an ever more complex world as they evolved. And I think this helps remind us that the rituals and stories we share are rooted deep in our evolutionary past. My guest today has been Professor Robin Dunbar. Robin is a professor of evolutionary psychology at the University of Oxford and fellow of the British Academy and of the Royal Anthropological Institute. His popular books include The Human Story, How Many Friends Does One Need, and his most recent book, How Religion Evolved and Why It Endures, links of which can be found on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Robin.
A great pleasure.
You've been listening to the final episode of our mini-series on how religion evolved with Professor Robin Dunbar. Across these 3 episodes, we've explored religion as an evolutionary force, one that shaped the human mind, bonded communities, built civilizations, and continues to influence our world today. Whether religion is in decline, transforming, or preparing for a resurgence in times of crisis, one thing seems to be clear: belief has played a profound role in what it means to be human. My thanks to Professor Robin Dunbar for this fascinating conversation, and thank you for listening to the series. If you've enjoyed it, you can find more episodes of Undercurrent Stories wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, goodbye.